Our second paper this morning is presented by Fatima McKague. Fatima is a PhD research candidate at the Centre for Sustainability at the University of Otago. Her research interests focus on fuel poverty, inequality and energy. And today, Fatima's paper explores fuel poverty in the context of the Energy Cultures Framework, Insights from New Zealand.
Thanks, Mary Jo. If I can find my presentation. Hello everybody, I'm Fatima. Shout out to Otago who's joining us through live stream. I wanted to share with you some of the findings from my PhD. Mic's on, guys. How about now? Now? Cool. I wanted to share with you some of the findings from my PhD, which is looking at energy hardship or fuel poverty as it is more broadly known, or the inability to afford your energy needs, and specifically looking at how we can apply the energy cultures lens and what we can learn from it. But I wanted to start by sharing with you why I am doing this research. I grew up in a very small country, one of the poorest countries in the world, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and growing up, energy, or rather the inability to access it, was a constant issue for us. This picture is a reenactment of how it was like for me growing up. Of course, back in the day, nobody had such buff bodies. We were all malnourished. But it's a fairly accurate portrayal of what life was like for me growing up. Men went fishing. We did communal cooking with firewood. We didn't have electricity. Life was very simple and easy. I remember doing my homework with using these kerosene lamps. Now when I think about it, just open flames, kid, paper, accidents just waiting to happen. We started getting electricity when I was about 6 or 8. We started getting it for a couple of hours a night. And we discovered these magical things called refrigerators and cold drinks, and life was never the same again. But we don't worry about energy as much now with solar readily available. We're moving towards 100% renewables. So when I moved to New Zealand, I moved to Dunedin. So I was really surprised to find that energy, not so much accessibility, but affordability was quite a concern for a lot of people. I noticed that in the community I was living in, which was a low decile, low-income community in Dunedin, that lots of people in my own community could not afford to heat their houses in winter, or if they did, they were somehow sacrificing some other needs in order to do so. And I was really surprised by my own living conditions. We were not necessarily in poverty, but we couldn't afford to heat our house. So I started noticing that this was, although very much related to poverty, this was much more broader than that, and we needed to highlight this. But what I was also noticing was that this was not only confined to the city I was living on or the community, but in fact all across New Zealand, the impacts of energy hardship and sometimes the devastating consequences of it was very clearly evident. In New Zealand, we measure fuel poverty using the 10% indicator, which is an economic measure, which means that if you use more than 10% of your household bills on your energy needs, you are considered to be in fuel poverty. And using this measure in 2009, it was estimated that 1 in 4 households in New Zealand were in fuel poverty, and this figure for Dunedin was 47%, which is perhaps not surprising. If you live there, you would understand we have a cooler climate and older housing stock. But part of the problem, I soon realized as I did more research into this, was exactly the way that we thought about it, the way we conceptualize it, the way that we measure it. But before I go into that, I would like to very quickly share with you some of the contributing factors which I think are impacting on the increasing fuel poverty levels in New Zealand. As we know, fuel poverty could be very multidimensional, many different factors influencing it, but one of the main factors, in my opinion, is the cost of electricity. And if you look at the cost of electricity for residential prices for New Zealand compared to the other countries, we can see that we have higher prices. Now, to put that in context, if we look at how that has changed over the years compared to the other sectors, we see that the residential prices are much higher. Now, to drive that point home, let's have a look at some other figures. Let's have a look at income. For the people on the bottom rung, the lowest income has not changed significantly over this same period. And to look at the other side of the equation, the housing, we see that the housing prices in New Zealand, that's New Zealand at the top in black, is much higher compared to other countries, OECD countries. And in some part of New Zealand now, it is almost unaffordable for first-time home buyers to get even into the market. So as a result, what you are seeing is this decrease in home ownership and increasing in people who are renting. Now, this is concerning for two reasons. One is that past research shows us that compared to ownership properties, rental properties are much lower standards in insulation, efficient heating. But the other reason is that we are also noticing that poorer income people, low income people tend to live more in rental properties. So what we see is this, by virtue of all these things, high electricity prices, low or no standards of insulation, inefficient heating, we see that for these people on the low decile, low income people, they have to spend significantly higher percentage of their income on their energy needs. So as a result, we saw in the past few years increase in the amount of research that was going on in energy hardship in New Zealand, as we saw the health impacts of living in coal damp houses. And the government started taking notice, and the council started rolling out programs, and they started focusing on the physical structure of the dwellings. Insulation schemes started rolling in, which is great because especially on Dunedin, where my case study is based, we still have quite a lot of houses that needs to be brought up to the minimum insulation standards. But what we did not factor in was one key thing. When we did an evaluation of the insulation scheme, we noticed that 77% of households that we interviewed who did have retrofits done, they were not really using them effectively. So we did not factor in at that point the behavioral side of how we were actually engaging with energy in our households, how we were responding, and the values and behaviors we brought in. And this was really interesting when I was talking to the participants of my study. A lot of people highlighted that in New Zealand, we have this attitude of towards cold, that you just put a jersey on and you put up with it. And there is an expectation that condensation is part of your house. It is a normal feature of your house. And central heating is unheard of. In winter, you heat just one single room of your house, and you base your daily routines around this single source of heating. So I needed to find a way to bring this all together, to drive this home, to find a way to capture this if we are to properly address fuel poverty and move on to transition to a better energy security and affordability. So to do that, we used the energy cultures framework. And this is very important for fuel poverty policy targeting, the target being to provide reasonably warm, healthy homes for people. And the question arises, what is a reasonably warm and healthy home, and how do we identify those needs? How do we identify those households? So in order to do that, I talked to, Dunedin was my case study, I talked to different households, different household types from different suburbs to try to better understand what it was like for them beyond an economic measure, actually for them who were experiencing fuel poverty. What were the barriers that were standing in their way? If we are to address this from policy perspective, what can we do different? And it was very nicely captured by the Energy Cultures Framework, that it again emphasizing the fact that we need to bring these different elements together. For example, this participant shared that of the material culture, that the heat pump is in a silly place, there's no insulation in the house, and the norms they were bringing in was you just toughen up and put another jersey on, and the energy practices was she was only heating the house right before the child came back from school. So using all this information, I collated an indicator for New Zealand, which is not a replacement for the 10% measure, but something that will work alongside it, that not only captures the technical, the economic terms, but also brings in this wider health and social and quality of life indicators, and this one component which I think is very important, the household needs, which we haven't really addressed at the policy level yet. But I also wanted to better understand from a policy perspective what New Zealand has done, how far we have come, where we need to go, and what were the barriers from a policy perspective. So in order to better understand that, Dunedin was my case study again. I talked with policymakers, researchers, and more importantly, people who are actually working in the coalface with these households, health organizations, community organizations, social organizations, to better understand what was happening. And again, using the energy cultures framework, it was nicely captured how we need to integrate this together. For example, this participant noted that there's something fundamentally wrong in New Zealand with the way we choose to supply power to households. In New Zealand, there is an expectation we just have cold houses, and the behavior of people stem from these beliefs. They sit covered in blankets or stay in bed. I'm still analyzing this data, and I don't have any specific policy recommendations to show to you yet, so stay tuned for this, some more to come. But at the end of the day, what do I hope to achieve by the end of almost 3 years of research coming to an end? At the end of the day, I want to raise awareness of energy hardship in New Zealand, that it is not only about poverty, that there are many different factors we need to consider. We need to bring in the behavioral, the wider social elements. We need to actually engage with people, not only on education and awareness, but if we are to change behavior and values, we need to engage with them and bring them as a participant into this debate. I am also a big advocate for region-specific measures. What is going to work in the North Island might not work the same way in the South Island, so I would be also advocating for that. But what is evident for me at the end of the day is that fuel poverty is very complex, and I'm not going to be able to solve it overnight or single-handedly, but if I can just raise awareness and work together with researchers and policymakers, but most importantly with communities and households, it might just be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Now, our third speaker today is Dr. Lindsey McCarthy. Lindsey is a research associate at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. So the title of Lindsey's paper this afternoon is Energy Inefficiency, Exploring What Tenants Expect and Endure in the Private Rented Sector in England.
Thanks very much, Mary Jo, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm a research associate from the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research, or CRESO for short. This is a research centre based at Sheffield Hallam University, just a few miles away from here in the north of England. And I apologise in advance if I'm a little rusty, I'm still recovering from jet lag. So I wouldn't be here today were it not for the support and generosity of a few individuals who I've listed on this slide. And this includes the Association of Commonwealth Universities, who funded my travel and conference costs as part of their early career academic grant scheme, my home institution, who have part-funded this trip, the Eager Charitable Trust, who funded the research this presentation is based on, the Centre for Sustainability, and in particular Janet Stevenson, for kindly accommodating me at the centre whilst I carry out further research in Dunedin. And last but not least, my colleagues Amy Ambrose and James Pinder, who allowed me to be the lucky one who gets to present the research here today. So before I begin, I just want to give you a very brief overview of the kind of research that we carry out at CRESO and where the research that I'm presenting sits within this programme. So CRESO carries out multidisciplinary research in the field of housing and urban policy, but in more recent years we've begun to develop a programme of research around housing and sustainability. This includes looking at responses to housing improvements, energy use in everyday life, energy policy and the politics of low-carbon transition, and fuel poverty, housing and health. So most recently, we've begun to look at energy performance in the private rented sector. Over the past 2 years, my colleague Amy Ambrose carried out research in relation to landlords' attitudes towards investing in energy performance in both the UK and in New Zealand, where she carried out research last year. So this stage of the research that I'm talking about today is more interested in the tenant side of the story. So what are tenants' expectations around energy performance in the private rented sector? Where does it sit in relation to competing priorities? And what barriers hold tenants back from making reasonable energy performance requests from their landlords? So the focus of this presentation is the UK study with private tenants, which we started in August last year, and we're just about to start analysing the data and writing the final report when I get back to the UK. This was very much a qualitative piece of work which sought to gain a more nuanced and in-depth understanding of tenants' experiences as well as expectations regarding energy performance in the PRS. We carried out the research across 2 case study areas, Rotherham Metropolitan Borough, which is a small local authority in South Yorkshire, and the London Borough of Hackney, which is a northeast inner London borough. We selected these areas mainly because of their geographical difference and the difference between their housing market context. So given the considerable difference between the housing market in London and that in the north of England, it was hoped that these 2 case studies would provide insight into a higher value, higher demand rental market and a lower value, lower demand comparator. So I hardly think I need to emphasise the importance of this kind of research because by virtue of being here today, we're all well aware and interested in the effects of poor housing and poor energy performance on health and well-being. But these are quotes that I picked from 2 tenants in Rotherham, Chris and Peter, and I found them particularly poignant. These were people for whom housing had experienced more of kind of hell rather than home, not the usual place that you retreat to, but somewhere that they wanted to escape from. So the first stage of the research involved a systematic review of the evidence, and we scoped out relevant literature around several key areas, including housing conditions and fuel poverty in the PRS, landlords' motivations and business models, tenants' rights and responses to energy efficiency initiatives. And this review was supplemented with 6 stakeholder interviews of individuals who had some expertise in one or more of these key areas. So we finished data collection at the end of June, and this consisted of a small postal survey of 750 households in the PRS across the 2 case study locations. And the purpose of this was really to gather basic background information, and the main reason really was it helped with recruitment as respondents indicated whether they wished to take part in an interview. And the main phase of data collection involved 50 in-depth qualitative interviews with tenants across Hackney and Rotherham. We tried to conduct as many of these inside tenants' homes because it gave us a better impression of property conditions and energy performance and allowed the tenants to describe them better too. So to understand the context for this research, it's very important to understand the changing nature of the private rented sector in England. England has seen a series of significant shifts in terms of housing tenure over the past 3 decades. After several decades of decline, the PRS has been on an upward trajectory of substantial growth since the late 1980s. So in 2003, the number of PRS dwellings in England stood at 2 million, and this figure doubled to 4 million 10 years later in 2013. For the first time in decades then, there are more people renting from a private landlord than from a social housing provider. And the growth of the PRS is of course not incidental, nor has it occurred in isolation, but it's coincided with the decline of the social rented sector and social rented house building over the past 3 decades, linked to wider privatisation and marketisation process, such as the right to buy policy in the late 1980s. It's important to recognise the PRS as a highly fragmented and highly diverse sector, and because of this, it's difficult to speak of it in terms of one coherent whole. So the sector caters for a wide range of demand, ranging from easy access and exit housing for the young, professional and mobile, to stopgap accommodation in between the sale and purchase of a house, to what is described as residual housing for low-income households and those unable to access owner-occupation or social renting. There is now increasing recognition of the role played by the private rented sector in accommodating low-income households, to the extent that the role of the PRS can hardly be described as residual at all, given that it's become the only option available for vulnerable and low-income households. So the image on the slide is a slight exaggeration, but it's really to illustrate the fact that conditions in the private rented sector are worse than any other tenure, and there are strong hints that we are retreating into an era of Dickensian housing conditions. The majority of PRS stock is old and in disrepair, but the state of the sector has arguably been worsened in recent years by successive government policies and cuts and the ongoing retrenchment of the welfare state in the UK. Evidence shows that some landlords have responded to reduced housing benefit rates by cutting spending on property management and maintenance. Poor housing conditions in the PRS extend to and encompass, of course, energy performance, which contains a higher proportion of energy-inefficient homes. It's not surprising that in 2011, nearly half of the households living in privately rented F and G on the Energy Performance Certificate rated homes were in fuel poverty. This is higher than in both the social rented and owner-occupied sectors. So in a context in which home ownership is unaffordable for the majority of households on low incomes, and the social rented sector is too small really to meet demand, a precarious private rented sector remains the only option. So going back to the research then, given what we knew about the assumed pathways into the private rented sector, which constitute in the main a lack of choice, as well as the poor conditions in the sector, we wanted to interrogate the evidence around what happens once tenants are in there. Do they simply put up with the poor conditions and the poor energy performance in that sector? Or is it more likely that they have little choice to do otherwise? So the dominant explanation within the literature comes in the form of the principal-agent thesis. And this, in the context of energy performance, relates to the mismatch between the party paying the costs, which in this case is the landlord, and the party benefiting from the improvements, the tenant. So landlords, according to this thesis, are unlikely to invest in energy performance on the basis that they will not recoup the cost of their investments. So it's the tenant who receives the benefits through increased levels of warmth and comfort and reduced energy bills. So the principal-agent thesis goes largely unchallenged in the literature, although my colleague Amy Ambrose, in her study of landlords' attitudes to energy performance in Dunedin, began to question its applicability to all contexts. She found that landlords in Dunedin did not conform that neatly to the contentions of the principal-agent thesis, and this in part perhaps relates to the diversity of the PRS and the varying motivations and business models of private landlords. So can such an all-encompassing grand theory be applied to such a heterogeneous patchwork private rented sector, or is there something more complex going on? So the crux of the matter really is that current housing legislation in England and Wales does not protect tenants from eviction when exercising their rights to have repairs and health and safety issues addressed. So Section 21 of the Housing Act allows landlords to legally end a periodic tenancy by serving a notice requiring possession, giving the tenant 2 months' notice to leave. As long as this notice is served correctly, tenants have no grounds for defence, and landlords do not have to give a reason for serving this notice. Tenants therefore occupy a very difficult position, being faced with the threat of eviction or rent increase if they dare to rock the boat, or having to live in poor conditions if they do not. And past research reflects this impossible dilemma. Questions included in the Survey of English Housing showed that 21% of private tenants were dissatisfied with the way that their landlords carried out repairs, yet only 1/4 of those tenants said they had tried to enforce their rights. When those who had not taken action were asked why not, 21% said they did not want to cause trouble, and a further 5% felt that their tenancy might be ended if they requested repairs. Without the force of the law behind them then, private tenants experience difficulty enforcing their rights given the lack of their security of tenure. This power imbalance means that landlords have little incentive to respond quickly, if at all, to requests from tenants for repair or energy efficiency modifications. And we found quite strong evidence of this from the qualitative interviews with tenants about their fear of raising any issues at all with their landlords for fear of eviction or rent increase. And this fear was well rooted in experience for some tenants whose landlords had increased their rent or threatened them with eviction for requesting repairs. For others, it wasn't so much fear, but more a sense of apathy, due to being let down by their landlords so many times, and they're now simply given up. So chiming with the principal agent thesis, some evidence suggests that tenants don't raise issues relating to energy performance because they're ill-informed, or they lack the awareness of their legal rights and are unaware of the energy efficiency initiatives available to them. Whilst we found some evidence of this, we also found evidence from some tenants who we spoke to who were well informed of what little rights they had. Some were actually part of private tenants associations. Some fought to assert their rights and demanded their landlords make improvements, and had gone further than this by getting the council involved. But in many cases, this didn't seem to make much difference. Tenants were often on short-term tenancies, so landlords would simply delay taking any action until the tenant moved out, and other demands were just met with silence and inaction. For low-income tenants, especially those receiving benefits, clearer information on energy performance may not be enough in itself. Especially in a pressurised housing market, simply finding a landlord willing to take them on as a tenant may be a more compelling factor than how easy it is to heat the property. We found evidence of this from our interviews, and as you can see from the quote on the slide, the energy performance certificate, which shows how efficient the building is, would not have made much difference to whether tenants moved in or not. The overriding priority was just finding somewhere to live. And once there, tenants were kind of stuck because it's difficult to find anywhere else to move in such a high-demand housing market, and moving itself is expensive. As one tenant said, they, or the landlords, know they can get away with a lot because people are desperate. So the emphasis in the literature tends towards one of tenant passivity, powerlessness, and low expectations, that because of current pressures on housing in some areas, people are desperate for any kind of accommodation and are willing to live in non-decent homes. Some suggest that private tenants lack the collective force to empower themselves because, unlike social tenants, private tenants' rights group do not represent a sufficiently mobilised or cohesive force to have a significant impact. There is, however, some emerging evidence to suggest that small pockets of private tenant awareness and anger is beginning to surface. And this begins to offer some hope that tenant pressure can bring about a shift in attitudes amongst landlords, although this, of course, does rely on a series of social and cultural factors coalescing to create the right conditions for change. Thanks very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. Can I now invite the three speakers, please, back up to the floor again? And we're going to have a couple of questions from the floor. So I'm going to leave the microphone with you.
Thank you for not having any questions.
Hello, hi, my name is Mari Maatiskainen. I work as a research fellow at the Centre on Innovation and Energy Demand at University of Sussex in the UK. Fatima, I really enjoyed your talk. I've done fuel poverty research in the UK, but I didn't know anything about the New Zealand context, so I was shocked to find that 1 in 4. I mean, is it really, what sort of policy responses are there for fuel poverty in New Zealand? I mean, are there kind of grant programs to help people stay at home? Or is there anything particularly
We're just starting to think about, and our initial response has been to target through insulation schemes, which is a great start. But we are starting to think about that we need to also have this behavioral component and education part to it, and actually involve the households in it. So policy has lagged behind, but the great news is that we are starting to think about it and talk about it at the policy level, and hopefully there'll be changes soon.
Can I just comment? Can I comment on that from maybe the policy side of things? No, it's good. I think fuel poverty is an interesting issue in New Zealand. The government doesn't have official statistics on it, so researchers take a measure and apply it themselves because there's lack of government effort. In response to your question, we've just recently mandated a minimum insulation and smoke alarm standard for private rental sectors that's going to come in force. It's already come in force now for social housing, will come in force for the PRS in a few years' time. There's the couple of people from the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, which not similar, but kind of similar to the Energy Savings Trust in the UK, that work closely with delivering household interventions. And as Fatima pointed out, there's insulation intervention. And the Ministry of Health also has a Healthy Homes initiative, which is a much more around not just insulation, but a wraparound service to a household. So how do you teach them about energy behaviors, ventilation, proper heating practices?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of give the perspective from the private rented sector. There has been like little initiatives that are aimed directly at the private rented sector stock in particular. There is a change in law which has taken place actually fairly recently in April this year, and this is to give tenants the right to make a reasonable energy efficiency request to their landlord. But this of course relies on the tenant being empowered enough and confident enough to actually make this request. Because as it is at the moment, as we found in our research, that tenants are actually scared to rock the boat for fear of being evicted. So perhaps there's a need for a more fundamental shift in law to give more power back to tenants.
Yeah, hi, it's John Williams from Otago University. I've got a question for you, Lindsey. One of the ways in which the socially disadvantaged can empower themselves is through the internet and social media in particular. Here in New Zealand, a number of students recently established a site called Rate My Flat. I don't know if you're aware of that or any kind of net-enabled, social media-enabled similar efforts in the UK or elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, I'm really interested in Rate My Flat. I've heard of that before, and there isn't really an equivalent in the UK that much. We found some evidence of tenant activism in Hackney, and this is possibly because Hackney is just just a greater hotbed for change, really. There's people with more social connections, and perhaps the conditions are worse there, and that's what it takes to actually empower people to take action. But Hackney, there's a group of Hackney private renters called Digs, and they were starting to do really interesting things, quite artistic things really, in ways of protesting. So they'd recently compiled this blacklist of letting agents, and they'd actually protested outside of these blacklisted letting agents. And so these were letting agents who wouldn't let to tenants on benefits, for instance. And this had led to some tiny change. So a few of the blacklisted letting agents had actually changed their policy in response to this. And although it was only about 2 or 3 that had done this, it was still a step in the right direction. So, yeah.
I think this was very interesting to hear about these energy poverty questions, both in New Zealand and in the UK. And of course, the conclusion is that poverty is a terrible thing as a whole, and that it is really increased by greedy landlords. So what I am interested in is there any plans in your research groups to do deep interviews or surveys with landlords in this private rental sector to get their ideas about this problem?
Well, I'm carrying out some research similar to this in Dunedin in about a week's time, actually, for free. I'm spending 3 weeks there, and I will be speaking to landlords and tenants. So hopefully I will gain some perspective from that study. In the UK, I think in our research centre, we've done similar research with landlords, but that was in a separate study, and unfortunately we didn't have enough funding for this particular project to speak to both tenants and landlords at the same time, but it would be great to do that as a follow-up research project.
In Otago, at the Centre for Sustainability, my office mate, Tish, she since paid me to say that she's doing the same kind of research similar to what Lindsey is doing, of trying to see landlords and tenants' perspective as well in New Zealand. So that would be really good to have both of those studies going on at the same time.
Yeah, there was a bit of research that was, I think it was the University of Otago, with the in-depth landlords interviews, and oh, right, okay. Yeah, right. So I think that's published now, isn't it? In the process of it, yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mara, from the Research and Enterprise Office at Otago. This is not a question, it's just a quick comment maybe for the people here in the room who are international visitors. Dunedin has about 100,000 people that live there and 25,000 students. So it's actually a fifth of the population are students. And so when you have the overall, that Fatima said, the 1 in 4, and then you see the 47% in Dunedin, that's 1 in 2, that there is obviously a very clear link to the fact that these people are students and that the students are transient. So I don't know anything more, I'm not the researcher, but I thought that this would be a really important point to consider when you look at that.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. Philippa Watson from the University of Tasmania. We've also conducted a bit of work on fuel poverty and on landlords and rentals. But I was wondering if you could comment on New Zealand's landlord structure. I believe it's probably more similar to Australia than to England in that the public housing sector or the social housing sector is much smaller in Australia, and I believe, is it similar here?
Well, I can speak for Dunedin. In Dunedin, we have a very market-based structure, and where the tenants, like somebody raised a point here, where the tenants have very restricted control over the market. So I think, and also the fact that we have a big student population, which is transient, again impacts on how it flows, the market moves. So it will be really interesting to compare that to another part of the city. Do you have something to add? Another part of the...
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with Tasmania's structure. In New Zealand, you have broadly the kind of mom and pop landlords, and then you have the institutional investment portfolio managers, and they actually own a substantial amount of the PRS properties here in New Zealand. So I think it's important to understand the differences between those. You know, the research shows that professional investors are much more savvy around energy efficiency, and they understand the value of tenancy retention rates and things like that, and are at the forefront of adopting, whereas the amateur investors or you know, smaller private landlords have different priorities.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. There's no obligation for landlords in the UK to be part of any kind of national landlords association, and so many of the more kind of mar and par landlords are not part of that body, and hence why it's so difficult for the government to engage with landlords and kind of shape policy, and engage with them, find out what their motivations are.
Thank you. I think it has to be said that the new energy efficiency standard for rental properties, the insulation standard, is not even the latest building code standard. It's kind of 1987 New Zealand building code standard is all it has to be brought up to. The government didn't have the guts to push for the latest standard. And secondly, I think that it is, well, I'm looking forward to the rental warrant of fitness trials that are about to start in Dunedin, Wellington and Hamilton, is it? Somebody should know that's from the medical sort of research and housing side. That warrant of fitness side, which looks at more than just the insulation, but also heating sources, because some of the assistance programs have been including heating source, and there is no law in New Zealand that a rented property has to have a heating source at all. You know, there's some appalling standards in New Zealand, and that's reflected by the data. What's in the UK? Is there a minimum standard of insulation for rental properties?
Well, I think there's a lack of legislation as well in the UK. I mean, the main thing that we have is the energy performance certificate, and that's like an EU
scheme, so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. And that shows how efficient the property is before a tenant moves in. But in the interviews that we did, in most cases, tenants weren't shown those EPCs by the landlord, and even if they were, they couldn't translate that information into the actual reality of it. So there is a sort of lack of provision of information and a knowledge gap.
Yeah. In the UK, they were passing PRS minimum EPC standard legislation, so to say that you can no longer go from just renting out G and Fs, you need to step it up. I'm not sure if it made it through all its hearings, so I don't know about the UK's, but in some ways the New Zealand regulation that's been put in force is perhaps not the ideal outcome, but it's further ahead than other jurisdictions.
Mm. Yes, Molly Mellish, Domestic Energy Users Network. I wonder whether you're aware whether MB, that is your ministry, you must have done a cost-benefit analysis as to choosing the level of standard of roof insulation. And I believe that the current roof insulation is required to be 75 millimeters, whereas the new standard is 100 millimeters. Do you know whether the difference between those two, the marginal value of fully insulating versus half insulating, ever crossed the mind of your ministry?
So you're correct. They're normal practice to do regulation impact assessments. It was the housing team that were leading that with the support of Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, ECA. It's worth saying that the initial proposed standard was for a millimeter-based insulation. There was a lot of feedback that went out for consultation. There was a lot of feedback from private individuals and the industry saying that you wouldn't get the outcome you want to get by doing that. So it's changed since into an R value standard, which means that you'll actually be achieving the outcome we want to achieve, which is sort of a reduction or improvement in R values. Where it finally landed to in terms of whether it's a depth or an R value, the policy, we're responsible for providing advice. Ultimately, it's down to the government to make the choices based on that advice. So it's been considered and advice provided.
And I think from a fuel poverty policy perspective, fuel poverty research perspective, some insulation is better than none, and the government is acknowledging it and talking about it. Hopefully we're moving in the right direction. It's taking us a long time, but we'll get there.
So I have a question that's for all three of you, really, and I was thinking back to Marcus's work, and you talked a lot about money being kind of the key driver of behavior. And I'm wondering around this trade-off between comfort and cost. And I don't know if comfort came through in your work or even if you were working with homes who were living in energy poverty and whether that was even a factor. But I'm just wondering if maybe the three of you had thoughts on this trade-off between comfort and cost and how you've seen this kind of play out in terms of behavior.
Yeah, I conducted about 300 interviews and about 90 in-depth interviews in the home. So lots and lots of cups of tea, which is the best way to get people in the UK to talk to you. Comfort came up a lot, lifestyle came up a lot, and interesting, money was very important, but it was this kind of the order of energy or energy priorities. Money was important, but it lists comfort. Where did comfort sit in your money-saving spectrum? And often it was, if you have the means, then you will take back what you can from the budget, so you get that thermal well-being or that comfort well-being. If you don't have the means, then you're underheating your house, and you're having all sorts of ill health effects. And it's complex with respect to policy. We did some trials around providing advice, like heating advice, so people use their heating more efficiently and save money. What we found when we monitored and measured energy use was that actually it was all taken back in comfort. So that's probably not achieving your energy policy objective, but perhaps it's achieving other government objectives around health and well-being. So it's a bit of a simple answer, but I guess like a holistic approach to interventions is important.
Yeah, we found lots of evidence of underheating and of people only heating one room and tending to socialise just in one room to save on heating costs. There was also like other health and well-being risks, such as rooms covered in damp and mould, and people were battling with the landlords trying to get them to change that. So they weren't thinking about saving energy because of any kind of eco-consciousness. It was mainly to save money. A lot of the tenants were on prepayment meters as well, so they could only use whatever electricity or whatever energy they had on that meter, and often it wasn't very much because they had very tight budgets. So yeah, it was mainly to do with cost, I guess, because they were on low incomes.
Hey, Becky, comfort would be a really nice threshold to achieve, but in the fuel poverty, we are just trying to reach from baseline to minimum health requirements. So comfort did come up, but it was further down the line.
Thank you. I've been sitting here listening, and I'll tell you where my hat starts. I'm listening as a landlord. I'm listening as a member of the National Energy Research Institute, a trustee, of which there's some others here in this room. I'm listening as the former Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment. And now you've got into the comfort zone, I'm really listening. And I'm listening because it seems to me that what we're unpicking here is obviously a very complex relationship between owners of buildings, occupants of buildings, and actually how you live in them. And what I would like to hear a lot more of is actually what you're all doing in the research field about the conversation and the dialogue with the owners of the buildings, and more importantly, the way they actually interact with their tenants. And my wife and I have had tenancies for nearly 40 years. We've always rented them ourselves. We've always put a lot of effort into the relationship, and we say, would we live in this building? And one of the most challenging things that we've found all the time is, in fact, developing an understanding of how it is to run a household, how it is to run the dynamics, the physics of a building called a flat. And it's very challenging with students. It's very challenging because they tend to come out of households where they don't do that, where they're modern houses, and they come into houses that are older. And although you can put all the technologies in there, extractors in the bathroom, extractors over the stoves and so on, it's very hard to get them to actually manage all those. So we have a check sheet, and we run them through every winter how to drive your flat. And the more technological you can make it now, the more you'll engage them. But the final trick, which really stunned us, was that we couldn't get people to use heating where you had the immediate control to put it on and off. And in fact, we went back to what in the New Zealand context is a very old form of domestic heating. It's called a night store heater. It's a thing which I saw many in your room understand. It heats up at a low cost power at night or during the day, and then discharges over a 24-hour period. That's the only way we can guarantee in our rental properties that there is enough background heat there. Okay? So I would like to hear more about those pieces of the sociological puzzle and the learning curve that you've got to go through as a landlord, but more importantly, the absolute ongoing training you've got to do with tenants, and particularly when they're under 20. Thank you.
That's a really excellent point you raised. We need to develop better relationships with landlords and work with landlords, and that is more relevant in Dunedin than any other place because we have a very high student population, and students have this mentality of it's cool to put up with the cold, and it's like a rite of passage that you go through. So you're absolutely right. We need to have better understanding and working with the landlords.
I have a question also. I think it's a question. You haven't mentioned the relationship between the issues with the renters face and actual housing policy between in both cases. For instance, I feel the UK has always had a culture of buying your own house, either to use for yourself if you have the money or to rent it out to somebody else. And that's what having a house seems to be about. And I wondered if it was the same in New Zealand also, and whether there could be things that could be changed, or whether changing that would change things in both countries.
In New Zealand, we have seen this trend of lots of renters increasing. And there are also, we need to raise awareness about these low-cost measures that we can do in the house, but that means targeting their behavior and the way that they use energy inside the house. One of you may.
If I can make a bold statement, not being born in New Zealand, about New Zealand culture, grant me the exception. It's very much that way, as in the home ownership expectation is what it used to be. Quarter acre is what everyone aspired for. You have your own space, your own. There is a shift, particularly in the urban centers, that they're struggling with in Auckland, and you can see it being played out in the headlines with respect to the Auckland City Council butting horns with central government with respect to how they do their developments. And that's all around, in my opinion, perhaps expectations of what home ownership and what kind of home ownership, like what kind of homes home ownership means, in especially urban centers like Auckland.
Yeah, I think that really kind of hits the crux of the matter, because why, the fact is that so many people are now living in the private rented sector in the UK. The social rented sector has the highest energy performance, has the best energy performance, but no social homes are being built now. So that's the kind of bleak situation that we're in.
Barry Barton from the University of Waikato. Just a couple of observations, power and supply. In the landlord-tenant situations, so much of it is dominated by the power relationship. Our legislation doesn't require a landlord to provide a house that is habitable, let alone heatable, and we get the consequences of that. What I think one of you, Lindsay, had about the tenants who know that their best bet of not being evicted is just keeping their heads down. The fewer interactions with your landlord, the better it is. And these are people who have very few choices in life, and that takes you to the other part, supply. In most of the country where supply is desperately short, they know that they have very few options to get a property of any kind without a huge amount of struggle. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good point to actually end the session on, I think, something to think about. I don't know if one person wants to respond really briefly. I'm just conscious that lunch is being served up, so.
Okay, guys, I'll give you a tip. I was coming to this conference and I told my 6-year-old son, I'm going to an energy conference, and he said, hey, save energy, shower with a friend. So there's a tip for you guys.
Okay, thank you so much to our three speakers. That was a really interesting session, and I think there's a number of people who still have questions, so I think we can definitely continue the discussion over lunch, or maybe later on in the day or tomorrow again. So if everyone wouldn't mind giving a round of applause to our three great speakers.